So it's a pleasure to be presenting this morning on Invex Therapeutics at the Small Caps Conference today. Here's our standard disclaimer, just reminding those persons joining the webinar today that there are certain forward-looking statements in the presentation today. Here's the company snapshot. As Carly mentioned in the introduction, we are a biopharmaceutical company that is repurposing an already approved drug called Exenatide, formulated as Presendin. Our clinical stage is in phase 3, and we have an orphan disease focus. Our orphan disease is a condition known as idiopathic intracranial hypertension, or IAH. And we have orphan drug designation granted for this indication in both the United States and Europe. Our addressable market, which I'll run you through, we believe is around 1.7 billion annually in the United States and the European Union. And as a potential or actual investor in Invex, the certain valuation drivers that we see are clearly related to our clinical progress, our regulatory submissions and eventual regulatory clearances, and also a strong and defendable patent position. If I turn to the capital structure of the company, market cap is around 60 million, with a very strong and conservative balance sheet of 33.6 million cash, principally the result of a $26 million capital raise in May 2020, and our enterprise value of around 30 million, we think, relative to the clinical stage we are at, which is entering phase 3, offers some reasonable risk reward upside for potential or actual investors. Directors and management hold around 17% of the issued capital. We have a range of institutional investors led by Tattarang, which is the Andrew Forrest Foundation, formerly known as Minderoo. And top 20 collectively own around 58% of the issued capital. Our board of directors has particular expertise and equity, clearly. Jason Loveridge, chairman, Professor Alex Sinclair, who is the world expert in IAH and an executive director and chief scientific officer of Invex, and we're very pleased to have her in the company day to day, assisting us with these plans. And David McAuliffe, non-exec director, and more recently we appointed Dr. Megan Baldwin, which I'll share more details on in February, and myself, Tom Duthy. So what Invex sort of, to paint a very clear executive summary and a picture, we like IAH as our first indication of choice, principally because it offers very attractive market dynamics. As I mentioned, we believe we have an addressable market at 1.6 billion per annum. The actual disease indication, IAH, is growing at 3.4% per annum, commensurate with much higher obesity rates in Europe and the United States. Unlike a lot of drug opportunities you would see day to day on ASX and elsewhere, we have a completely unencumbered market opportunity here. There are no approved treatments for IAH currently on the market, and there are, beyond ourselves in IAH for Exenatide Presendin, there are no new treatments in human clinical trials for this disease. More particularly, there is a market pull for new therapies because of the impacts this disease has on patients' quality of life, particularly. And so this urgent market need also comes with the fact that Exenatide Presendin is expected to be chronically administered to these patients. We have supportive clinical data for our late-stage registration aspirations. In phase 2, we showed a clear statistical and clinical benefit in these patients on both primary and secondary endpoints. And we showed that the drug effect was sustainable over 12 weeks with no significant safety concerns. And we plan to file an application to commence a registration phase 3 study for IAH in Europe this calendar year. We also have significant barriers to entry. The legislated orphan drug designation we have gives us 7 years in the United States and 10 years in Europe. And we have a number of issued and pending patents that protect the use of Exenatide in IAH and pressure-related disorders of the brain. Just turning to our Q1 highlights to date, as I mentioned, in February, we appointed Dr. Megan Baldwin as a non-exec director of the company. Those who are familiar with Megan know the commendable job that she has done as CEO and MD at Opthea Limited, which is an ophthalmology development company focused on retinal disease, particularly age-related macular degeneration. And she's been able, with her team, to rapidly advance her lead candidate into 2 phase 3 studies. She has a very strong institutional backing and raised $180 million on NASDAQ in October 2020. So she's a welcome addition to the board and offers us significant value when it comes to our development pathways, and also with her particular ophthalmology expertise, noting that there is an ophthalmology bent to this disease, with around 1/4 of patients actually suffering permanent vision loss. During the quarter, we have focused our activities on finalising the selection of our formulation, a preferred formulation, Presendin, which we will take through clinical trials. That is pending and imminent. Concurrently, we have advanced discussions with contract manufacturers capable of producing clinical grade Presendin material for that program, as I mentioned. That's also pending and imminent. We've also sought significant expertise and expert input into our planned phase 3 program, which is ongoing. And we are on track to submit to the US Food and Drug Administration a request for a Type B or pre-IND meeting before the end of this quarter. So filing for, should I say, submitting to meet with the FDA, and we expect to meet with them and have the response from that meeting in Q3 of 2021. Just to really define IAH, it's a disease probably unfamiliar to most on the call if they've not heard this presentation before, but it is a disease where there is uncontrolled pressure in the brain of these patients, who are typically over 90% women of childbearing age, and there's no known cause. And the incident, and there's approximately 4.7 patients per 100,000 of population in Europe and the United States. As I mentioned, these patients do have significant quality of life issues with their disease, with over 90% suffering headaches that are progressive. And as I mentioned, 25% will suffer permanent vision loss due to the uncontrolled pressure in their brain, exerting a pressure effect on the optic nerve, and therefore over time killing the optic nerve and basically imparting permanent vision loss. There's an impact from a cost effective for managing these patients. The way to manage severe patients at the moment is only via surgical interventions. 40% of patients require repeat hospital administration, and a study recently in the United Kingdom, showed that the healthcare costs associated with this disease are expected to increase 5-fold. So it's important, clearly, to keep these patients managed and to keep them out of hospital. And that's the solution that we offer here. So Alex Sinclair was the first to show scientifically that an existing drug called Byetta, which is a GLP receptor agonist commonly used in the treatment of diabetes, actually acts on similar receptors in the brain and a part of the brain called the choroid plexus. And these group of cells are responsible for controlling the amount of cerebral spinal fluid that bathes the brain, and therefore ultimately controls pressure as measured by intracranial pressure, or ICP. So we know we have a strong scientific basis for benefit. We have a very well-defined mechanism of action, and we have very significant phase 2 data to support the fact that this drug does lower pressure in the brain, and by lowering pressure, it also reduces headaches and reduces vision. Current treatments for IAH are very limited, as I mentioned to you. We now, as the disease has become well known and its incidence is growing, we have very clear diagnostic criteria, i.e. how do you diagnose a patient with IAH? And most interestingly, in the last 3 years, we now have defined treatment guidelines in both Europe and the United States on exactly the cookbook, if you like, on how clinicians should stratify and treat these patients. Importantly, from Invex's perspective, consensus treatment guidelines are a recipe for specialists to use certain drugs and devices, and we're very pleased that Alex Sinclair is the author of those guidelines. So it allows us, we believe, to very rapidly be incorporated into these guidelines in the event that we are able to show clinical efficacy in phase 3. if we classify these patients into two buckets, those that don't require immediate surgical intervention and those that do, the treatment guidelines stipulate there in light green, there's one drug, it's a 50-year-old drug called acetazolamide, which doctors can consider using for these patients. However, I remind people on the call that this drug is not approved. It's not regulatory cleared for IAH. It's been used in anxiety and travel sickness, I believe, historically. And so what we see here is that upon regulatory clearance and clinical success, that Presendin will replace that green box, acetazolamide, in the treatment of these patients. Additionally, we believe there's an opportunity post-surgically for patients who require a neurosurgical intervention to lower their pressure, and also for those with vision impairment require a very invasive ophthalmology procedure called ONSF. And we believe that we offer a post-surgical option for these patients to maintain a balanced pressure paradigm post-surgery. Our total addressable market, here's a schematic. I won't go through this in detail. Here's a schematic on how we arrive at our TAM. I think most importantly here, it's a very robust patient population of around 40,000 in Europe and the United States, which makes it that orphan disease. Interestingly, only about 60% of these patients are ever diagnosed with IAH, which in its own right offers some opportunity to improve. But what we do know is that 90% of these patients are drug treatable based on the literature. And if we ascribe a notional price per Presendin per month of $1,500, we arrive at a sort of a total all-in market opportunity of 1.6 billion and an annual opportunity of 380 million. So very nice market dynamics. And as I said, growing at 3.4% implies that this will be over $2 billion in TAM in 2030. Important, of course, for any biopharmaceutical development company to think about who are going to be the doctors that either refer patients to treatment or will be interested in the outcomes of our clinical trials. So for patients with IAH, they are typically seen initially by an optometrist because of blurred or distorted vision. These optometrists then refer to an ophthalmologist. And for IAH, it's a very small pool of specialist doctors called neuro-ophthalmologists. So again, from a marketing perspective for a new drug, it's a very insular subspecialty that focuses on this disease. And the same also holds true for neurologists, right? So I mentioned over 90% of patients have intractable headaches. Well, here we have a specialty where about 2,000 docs in the United States specialize in headache. To walk you through the phase 2 results, we met our primary endpoint of a reduction in ICP over 3 time points, 2.5 hours, 24 hours, and 12 weeks. And we saw an 18 to 21% reduction across those time points. From a clinical outcome perspective, we were also delighted to see that the reduction in monthly headache days was very significant in these patients, whereby there was a 7.7 day reduction per month, or 37% improvement in headaches versus a placebo. And interestingly, and perhaps a little surprisingly, we're also able to in a statistically significant and clinically meaningful way, improve vision in these patients, where essentially after 12 weeks, there was approximately a 1-line vision improvement, which is quite profound and can be the difference between driving or not. As you'd expect, being a drug that's been approved by the FDA and we're repurposing for IAH, the SAEs were negligible, so no SAEs. Adverse events were commensurate with Exenatide as its current form by ETA for diabetes, which was a bit of nausea in patients. So this data provided us a very good platform to launch plans for a phase 3 study. Here are our lead-in activities for the phase 3 trial that we plan to commence during the 2021 calendar year. So we have 4 main activities. The reformulation I mentioned, the manufacturing I mentioned as being both very imminent milestones for the company, but those 2 events really drive everything else. So we have a couple of other lead-in activities that we're required to perform to meet the regulatory requirements for a repurposed drug. And that is tolerability. So we're just looking at whether our formulation has any effects at the injection site in animals. We don't expect that to be any issue whatsoever because the excipients of our preferred formulation are already in use. The second thing we need to do is a human pharmacokinetic study. So to take a reformulated Exenatide as Presendin, which is a once-a-day formulation, and show in a human PK study that the pharmacokinetics of the administration of this drug will offer a once-a-day dosing regimen. And we are required under regulatory regimes to ensure that that formulation does not increase the amount of drug in the blood or the amount of total drug available versus the reference drug, which is Byetta. Here's our regulatory update that we provided previously. There's not a great deal of change here, except to show that we have continued to progress the EMA. So taking the left-hand side of the slide here, the European Medicines Agency, we have completed that dialogue through the protocol or scientific advice platform that's on offer there for companies like Invex. We received the feedback in December 2020, which investors will recall. And taking that information now, we are in the advanced planning stages, as I've mentioned, to complete a study protocol and a statistical analysis plan. And these documents are not only useful for our FDA aspirations, which I'll come to in a moment, but also set the scene for filing with national health authorities a clinical trial application, which then allows Invex to commence a single phase 3 trial for registration of this drug in Europe. With the FDA on the right-hand side, investors may recall we received initial feedback in July 2020, whereby we asked the FDA whether an ophthalmology or vision-based endpoint versus a headache-based endpoint, which they would prefer. That was triaged by the Division of Ophthalmology, who acknowledged that the number of headache days is a clinical meaningful endpoint, but we needed to go back to them with two things. The first of which was a statistical analysis plan, and the second of which was a clinical protocol. So since that feedback, we've, commensurate with our European obligations, we've been developing that plan. And as I mentioned at the start of the call, we are on track to submit to the FDA the statistical analysis plan and the study protocol before the end of this current quarter. As investors will no doubt realize, our overarching aim here is to harmonize the FDA feedback with the European feedback such that we may be able, or it may be permissible for Invex to undertake a single phase 3 study which qualifies for registration in both the United States and Europe. At this stage, we can't be drawn on whether that will be the outcome of the FDA discussions, but undoubtedly following the meeting request and the actual meeting itself in Q3 of 2021, we'll have a more definitive answer from the Food and Drug Administration whether one study is acceptable and whether our design is also acceptable. But taking the bird in hand approach, irrespective of the FDA, we know the European Medicines Agency is accepting of a single phase 3 study, and we plan to prosecute that through to a phase 3 and a reportable result. I just wanted to conclude with a couple of slides, and I wanted to, I guess, update that irrespective of the impact of COVID-19 on our lives as potentially healthy people, COVID-19's had a very significant impact on the IH population. So there was a recent study published by Alex Sinclair and colleagues that showed that in the United Kingdom, where there's been several lockdowns, there's been almost a 5-fold increase in emergency surgical procedures to avoid permanent vision loss for IH patients. And they attribute this very large spike in surgery to impaired access of these patients to care. There's been delays in routine waiting times, which helps for prognosis, diagnosis, and treatment options. And these patients have also been locked in. And so given that the link with obesity, they've seen increased weight gain, and therefore their IH condition has exacerbated. So these are really important studies. And the IH charitable group in the UK also surveyed under this sort of same scenario And 45% of respondents said life was harder under a UK lockdown, given the increase in stress, the reduction in activity and the weight gain, all of which are contributing factors for this particular condition. So we conclude from that, undoubtedly that, lockdowns have shown us one thing, and that is there is this significant market need for non-surgical new therapies to treat these IAH patients outside of the emergency hospital setting. So we see a cost benefit to that. We see a patient benefit to that, and that drives our thinking every day at Invex. So just to summarize before I turn back to Kylie at AusBiz, we have a large and growing market for IAH, and as I said, it's an unencumbered market opportunity, which is very rare, I guess, in most biopharmaceutical circles. We have that layer of protection offered by orphan drug designations that give us absolute exclusivity upon market registrations, so a monopoly position. We have strong phase 2 data, which I'll walk you through. We are in a very strong financial position. We have an attractive enterprise value. And we believe if we compare and contrast that to our sort of comparable companies on ASX, both on orphan, ophthalmic and repurposing, we think, again, as I mentioned, we offer reasonable risk reward upside for shareholders and prospective investors. Here are our 21 milestones. As I mentioned, we've got 2 near-term events. We expect to complete a submission to the FDA before the end of March to sit down with them in a pre-IND meeting. We expect to have the formulated response from the FDA in Q3 with a next steps, if you like, for our program in the United States. And subject to the availability of our manufacturing of Presendin under GMP or good manufacturing practice, we think we can start a human PK study in Q3. That timeline has moved a little bit from first half, reflecting the fact we still need to sign that contract for manufacturing. We can commence the tolerability study in animals, we believe, this half. Filing a clinical trial application in Europe. We've pushed that into the second half, again, principally relating to the knock-on effect of manufacturing and obtaining a manufacturing slot for production of materials. And we've also, our final milestone is commencement of the actual study itself, the phase 3 study, in late second half 21 to first half 2022. So again, a slight delay here on our planning and timelines reflective of manufacturing. So with that, I will turn the call back over to Kylie at AusBiz for Q&A. Thanks, Kylie.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, excuse me, we do have some questions coming in. Firstly, I just wanted to clarify, you talked about your TAM there, I think $2 billion by 2030. Can you just clarify the competitive landscape? You talked about really being the only people in this specific space. Is that $2 billion TAM, all up for grabs, as it were, completely for you?
That's exactly right. So TAM is a function of the all-in market opportunity. So taking, say, the 2020 TAM of 1.6 and compounding that by 3.4% a year for 10 years, you get that, I think, 2.3 billion in TAM. So that is the all-in market opportunity for those 2 jurisdictions. Invex, as the phase 3 company and the only company in clinical development with a therapeutic agent in IAH, currently 100% of that TAM is up for grabs. However, pragmatically, it is exceedingly unusual for drug developers to ever capture 100% of the TAM. So it's there as a figure to highlight to investors the all-in opportunity.
Yeah.
As the first to market, you can capture TAM reasonably quickly.
Yeah. So first to market, what are the barriers to entry for other people, in this space who may bring other programs or trials?
Yeah. So we, under the orphan drug designations in both Europe and the United States, we are protected from other drug developers or other companies who wish to use Exenatide, derivations of Exenatide, to treat intracranial pressure, particularly IAH. So that stops people taking another formulation of Exenatide and then using that in IAH. So that gives us that exclusivity. We can also rely on top of that our US patent and pending patents which covers the use of exenatide and derivatives for pressure-related disorders of the brain. So the inventive step here is that this is a diabetic treatment that sells many hundreds of millions of dollars a year. We, with Alex Sinclair, have taken the novel and inventive step of showing that that same drug lowers pressure in the brain and therefore improves IAH patients through reduction in headache and vision loss.
Okay. Thank you. There's a question from Jonathan around the timing, and obviously I understand with ASX requirements, there may not be much you can say about this, but in terms of the forthcoming announcement on the exact formulation of Presendin and the appointment of the contract manufacturer being imminent, do you expect the company to make these two announcements prior to the end of this month?
Yeah, it's a good question. Imminent can be the difference of a day, a week, or two. All I can say there is we are well advanced in our discussions with contract manufacturers to produce formulated Presendin. So the imminent is unfortunately a term that has lacks a defined day or week to it. But I would say that investors should watch out in the very short term for this contract and this formulation being completed and announced, more importantly for the market.
Yeah, okay. You talked about a phase 3 study potentially being able to go ahead simultaneously in Europe and the USA. How common or rare is it to get approval to go down that path? Yeah,
so orphan drugs, when you receive orphan drug designation, typically, and I say typically, the watermark is a single well-designed phase 3 study that shows both efficacy and safety. So that's very different to your standard drug development pathway of 2 pivotal phase 3 studies to show much the same thing. So the designation reflects the fact that as an orphan disease, it's hard to recruit patients. There's fewer of them, and the timelines can get inordinately pushed out by that by the lack of patients into studies. And so the US FDA and the European Medicines Agency say much the same thing. However, in practical terms, they're not bound to give every company the right to conduct just one study. And so for orphan drugs, I think the literature supports the fact that on average, I think it's 1/3 to 1/3 or slightly higher than that of orphan drugs are required to do 2 studies. So we have, when I say we have the bird in the hand here, the European Medicines Agency has given us scientific and protocol advice stating that they will accept one well-designed clinical study. What we don't know at this juncture is whether the FDA will accept 1 study, whether they'll accept 2 studies, and whether they are comfortable or otherwise with our phase 3 design, looking at pressure and headache. Okay. So once we have that feedback from the FDA, we'll be in a much better position to understand whether we can harmonize a single global study for both markets, or if we're required to undertake 2 studies with the FDA, will we and should we push ahead rapidly into Europe? So the European market is 60% of our TAM, by the way. So it's not as though this is an esoteric tiny market opportunity. There are 60% of our IAH patient pool sitting in the European Union. Great.
All right, we're going to have to wrap it up there. We do have to move on to the next presentation. Dr. Tom Duthy, really appreciate your time. Interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.